Good morning. Today is Erev Rosh Chodesh, the 29th of Iyar. Tonight will already be Sivan, which means all of the exciting events that the Torah records um, that, that are in the beginning of Parshat Yitro and the story of the Matan Torah are all happening. We get to relive those events starting tonight and tomorrow, Rosh Chodesh Sivan, and today is the 11th of May, not April. We got out of April and it's the 11th of May. And we're learning Masechet Shabbos, and we now have the distinction of being on the 50th double-sided page, meaning we're 100 or 98 pages into the Talmud, and we're talking about Muksa, Kavana, the designation, Muksa, I said Muksa already. And so that's what we're talking about. That's what we're going to continue talking about. You may recall, a long time ago, 2 days ago, we discussed palm branches, or not palm, well, some part of the palm branches. It had a variety of potential uses. Some very much muksa, such as kindling wood. Although again, I'm not quite certain the wisdom of using palm branches for kindling wood, but I suppose in the absence of all other options, that may have been a common function, or maybe when it dries out. My impression, although I've never tried, is that it would be a very smoky kind of fuel. But again, I may be wrong. But it can be also used for seating arrangements. It could also be your seat. And that would be an entirely permissible use on Shabbos. And so the question the Gemara began, and we're going to continue today, is what does it take to turn a palm branch into a non-muktzah item? Does it need to actually be created into a seating, I don't know what you call it. Does it need to be turned into a seating arrangement? Does it need to be in thought of such? Does it need to have no preparation at all? And that's really the discussion that our Gemara is having, and we'll pick it up from here. So we're going to share the screen. And just before we start, two important dedications. Of course, all of us are watching the news in Eretz Yisrael, and we're thinking and feeling for our brothers and sisters, and for our land, for our people, and we dedicate our learning for their well-being, their protection, and for resumption of safety, peace for everyone in Eretz Yisrael. And of course, that's on our minds. And in particular, yesterday was a day that should have been exclusively used for celebrating Yerushalayim, and we commemorate now a whole many years since we had a reunited Yerushalayim with Jewish access to the old city, to the Kaisel. And so we pray that Hashem continue to shine his blessings down upon Yerushalayim and all of Eretz Yisrael. Also like to mention that we're in the midst of the Shiva for Yosef's mother. So that would be Esther Bas Simcha and Asod. So we'll mention her name, and of course a prayer for all those on our list that are in need of healing and blessings. Hashem should do so. Miyadai Hamleya Hapsucha Klesha from Hashem's open and overflowing hand, full of blessing. That is our dedication, and now let's jump right in. I hope you're not going to be bored if we're just going to recap this last paragraph that we read on Sunday, today being Tuesday. Tana Rabba Bar Chana Kamei de Rav. Rabba Bar Chana taught the following tradition, the following teaching before Rav. Again, we did this on Sunday. Chariya Shel Dakel, palm branches, palm fronds, Shegidoran Le'etzim, that were designated and were chopped, as I think Rashi told us. The word Gidoran means they were harvested or they were chopped collected for firewood. Vinim lachalein liyeshiva, but then he said, you know what, I'd rather use this for sitting. I have chashav honorable guests, and I want to give them this very, very comfortable seat of palm branches. I'm trying to imagine that it doesn't quite work out in my mind, but I suppose things may have been different back then. And so he decides that he wants to use them for sitting. Sarech lekasher, the first opinion in this brisa says there must be an action of tying them and arranging them in a manner that is conventional for sitting. And Rashi points out, if they had not been tied, they would be considered muktzah, because machshava alone, just kavana, just thinking, is insufficient to take out that which was previously designated for a prohibited use and therefore is muktzah, and to be reinstated as permissible for use. That's the first opinion here. Again, tzarech lekasher, you must do an action to change it from a muktzah before Shabbos, to make it from a muktzah to a non-muktzah status. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer. Shimon Gamliel says, "Ein tzarech lekasher team kavana can counter Rabbi Shimon Gamliel on their team." He says, no need lekasher, no need to do a physical act of tying it. Your designation in your mind, in your intention is sufficient. Now, actually, you're going to probably ask me a question, and I'm not certain in this moment. Maybe it's not kavana, maybe it's a statement. But anyways, here, it doesn't say that. So we can understand that it means a machshava or intention. Let's keep an eye out if there are any other steps in between action and machshava. Is there such a thing as dibur? Is there such a thing as a statement? What if you print a sign that says, these are my seating? So we'll keep an eye out.
One might say that binding those branches is change. The use of them changes. Sorry, I take it back. It's like doing something is in not a regular way. That is, those branches were separate, and as such, they couldn't be moved according to this opinion. But then when you tie them together, it's a different mode of use. And this is probably why they could be used with this opinion.
The professor is saying, if I understand correctly, it's not that you have one item that has two uses. You have loose palm branches, which are good for fire, and then you have tied palm branches, which are good for sitting. And so it's not at all a question, the professor is explaining, it's not about designation, it's about identity. It's about what is this item? And by tying it, you're turning it into a seating arrangement. I have a strong feeling that there are opinions that understand it as the professor does. Rashi,
one might say that you cannot create a new item on Shabbos.
Because that's true, but here we're talking about prior to Shabbos. All of our discussions here are before Shabbos started, did it have a new status? And according to the first opinion, it can only attain a new status by actually tying them, by doing something tangible, literal, physical. So the professor says because they were just transformed, you manufactured a seating, I don't know what you call them, not a cushion, and that's not a chair, and it's not a rug or a carpet or whatever, but you fashioned a seating option. But Rashi seems to understand it a little differently. Rashi doesn't seem to view the tying as transforming its identity. He looks at it more as a actions that created that declaration. All it's doing is indicating that they are seated. They are for seating. So Rashi uses a more delicate word, that it's more about an action that indicates intent, or it's an action that creates a new designation. But I'm fairly certain that there are going to be those that would understand it as the professor does. And so there we have it. Our initial discussion of Tanakama saying you need to do an action, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel saying action is not needed, and thought, mental designation is sufficient. And then Hu Tanila, Hu Amarla, Rabba Bar Chana, who was presenting this Mishnah, says Halacha ki Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. The halacha follows the viewpoint that is that of Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, which is less action is needed. Kavana, designation, can be mental, in your mind, in your intention as well. Again, all of these changes must occur before Shabbos, because you cannot, designation is frozen the moment Shabbos begins. So these all must be done before Shabbos. If it's set aside at the onset of Shabbos, it is essentially set aside for the remainder of Shabbos. Excuse me. The Gemara now continues to analyze and to take it a step further, because we're going to now be introduced to a third possible option. Itmarav. Itmar, we're taught that Rav says, Koisher, all you need to do, or not all you need to do, what you need to do to establish if a branch is for a permitted use, it's not muksa, or if it is muksa, Rav says Koisher, you got to actually tie it, taking the more strict viewpoint that we just read a moment ago in the Brisa. Shmuel Omar, again, just to point out, what we read here was a Brisa. So the authorities, the rabbis here are rabbis of the Mishnah. Again, this is not a text of the Mishnah, but this is rabbis of the era of the Mishnah. And we are now reading a text from the later era of the Gemara, where we are sampling and surveying how they paskin, what they actually advised their folks to do. Rav said, Koisher, in order for your branches to not be muksa, they need to be bound. They need to be tied in preparation for sitting. Shmuel says, Choishev. Machshava alone is sufficient. So, Professor, now that I think it's I that made it complicated by saying, oh, I'm not sure. When he says you don't need to tie it, what does he mean? Does he mean a designation? Does he mean a sign? Does he mean words? Well, based on this text, it's fairly clear that we're talking about a machshava. We're talking about thought, we're talking about kavanah. So this clarifies that which was slightly ambiguous just a moment.
Rabbi.
Yes, Rabbi Beryl.
Could a person say that these palm leaves are whatever they are, but if I have guests on Shabbos, I will use them for whatever?
It is possible, but not certain. Let's keep an open mind as we continue to discuss these discussions. It's possible that would be enough to consider a non-muktzah. But again, at this point, we don't have sufficient data to make that determination. So again, Rav says koisher, you gotta do an act. Shmuel says choishev, machshavas, and here's the wild card. Ravasi goes somewhere in middle. Yoishev, if the person sat upon those branches prior to Shabbos, apal pisha kisher, although he didn't do an act that permanently displays its new designation, Yoishev, if he sat on them, Erev Shabbos, apal pisha kisher, apal pisha chishev, even if he didn't do an act that would declare its use, and maybe he did not even have that moment where he said in his mind, I hereby designate mentally that these should be used for sitting. He didn't think about it, but he did it. Which, if I understand correctly, and we're going to ask Dr. Hammer to help us figure this out, it sounds like his actions are displaying his subconscious understanding of what they are to be. He didn't even have an active conscious thought, oh, I hereby designate. But by doing something, he shows us what his instinctive sense of the purpose of those branches. That's what I believe it's saying, but I'll await the professions here. But Rav Asi Amar Yoshev Alehem Iba'idim. He points out that important point that I think the professor pointed out, which is that obviously all of these changes of designation, or all of these, all evidence about the status of a muktzah item must be done prior to Shabbos. Let's read Rashi. How Rashi understands. Even though he didn't say in his mind, I look forward to sitting on these branches tomorrow. He's just thinking, I am sitting on them now. He's not thinking, he's just sitting on them. Still, even though he didn't think, Alehem leishev l'machar, to sit on them tomorrow, Goli date to l'yeshiva kame. His actions have made it absolutely evident to everyone who cares to know that he views them as sitting material, even without an elaborate, complex mashal. So we're left with three different opinions. One opinion says you must do an act which permanently displays its intended use by tying them together. Believe me, I don't know, but I don't imagine that in order to use something for firewood, you need to do any, if it's in a bundle, you don't need to do any extra tying. Tying it shows that you intend to preserve it and keep it, and it should be arranged in a precise way to make sitting somewhat more pleasant. I'm going to assume these are not palm branches that have thorns like we have in Florida. I'm going to assume, or some of the palm branches anyways, I'm going to assume these were branches that would be at least somewhat comfortable to sit Shmuel says, have machshava. Think to yourself before Shabbos, these are not muksa. I want to use them tomorrow. And we have Beryl's outstanding question, which is, what if he says, I might want to use them. If I need them, I'll use them. Probably that's considered designation according to Shmuel. I hope I don't eat those words, but that's what I believe the pshat would be. And Rav Asi says, you don't need to do a permanent act, and you don't even need to actively think about tomorrow. Your behavior shows us where your mind is at, and your behavior shows us how you perceive and what you intend to use these branches for, even if you didn't have an elaborate machshava about it. All right, the Rishonim are, as you can imagine, it's complicated because is this a escalation? Are these a series of chumras? Are these a series of kulas? What is the order? Rav says you got to tie. That's the most strict opinion. Then Shmuel says machshava is enough. Is Rav Asi a lower on the totem pole? Is it a bigger kula, a bigger leniency, or is he somewhere in middle? And you can go different ways because on one hand he's missing machshava, active machshava, but on the other hand he has done a ma'aseh. So the Rishonim want to know exactly what the hierarchy of chumrah, what are the hierarchy of stringency and leniency in this event. But I think for our purposes we can leave it as three different opinions. I don't know if we need to structure it that way to understand this.
Rabbi.
Yes.
If let's say I cut those, let's say they're dead branches, they're almost dead, and I cut them down and I'm going to burn them. One day I'll burn them.
Yes.
I'll accumulate a couple of them and then I'll burn them. And then Shabbos comes along and I say, wait, I got a good idea. I'm going to use them as seats.
Okay.
So
when
my thought was
when did you have that thought? On Shabbos or on Erev?
Before Shabbos. Before Shabbos.
Okay.
I'm having a few people over and I can put them as seats.
Right.
2 weeks later, I'm not using them anymore. Could I burn them then?
Oh, your machshava, your designation for the purposes of muktzah, which is that I'm going to use it in a permissible manner, does not preclude what you're allowed to do to them at a future date. It's just simply the purpose of our conversation is, are these accessible to you on Shabbos, or are they halachically out of bounds to you? They would be halachically out of bounds if their use is prohibited and your designation, mental or subconscious, is prohibited. But that certainly would not preclude your using them in the future. So you could certainly change their status. The only time you can't change the status of an item is on Shabbos itself, which is either muktzah or it's not muktzah.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you for asking that to allow us to clarify. Now the Gemara has a problem with our recently quoted three opinions, Rav, Shmuel, and Rav Asi. What's the problem? Here is the problem. Bishlama Rav, the comment of Rav, who says you got to tie the branches Erev Shabbos to indicate clearly that these are going to be for seeds. The Amar Ketana Kalma, he is embracing the first opinion in the Brisa, which says you got to tie it. Ushmuel Nami, Shmuel, who says Chishev Machshava is sufficient. Udika Amar Kiravan Shimon ben Gamliel. He is speaking the opinion of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. That's who he is embracing. So they have Mishnaic authority to hang their hats upon. They're not contradicting Mishnah precedent. They are taking an opinion in a Mishnaic debate. El Ravasi, but Ravasi's comment that said sitting before Shabbos is sufficient to indicate what his understanding of the use is. The Amar Kaman, does he have an opinion in the Mishnah world to hang his hat upon, or is he contradicting the precedent established by the sages of the Mishnah? And as we know, as much as it's complicated and we're still in the midst of learning all of the intricacy of Talmudic style and formula, what we do know is that there are rules. And one of the very well-established rules is that a rabbi, again, maybe that's not the most precise title, but an Amora, a Torah scholar, a sage of the Talmudic era is not authorized, they don't have the halachic might to run counter to the Mishnah.
Rabbi,
Yes.
didn't we say halacha k'moy Shimon ben Gamliel? Doesn't that put an end to this? Aren't we going back before that?
So, who said halacha k'Rav Shimon ben Gamliel? You're asking a good question. Thank you for asking that. But who is the one that made the statement halacha k'Rav Shimon ben Gamliel? Was it the Gemara making a declaration to all of us? No. Rabbah Bar Chana took a position. He said, I think halacha follows Rav Shimon ben Gamliel. Rav, who actually was sitting there and heard him review this Mishnah, embraced the Tanakama. He embraced the first opinion. So Rav actually disagrees with Rabbi Bar Chana. But you're asking a very good question, and I had to think for a moment when I was first reviewing this Gemara. I had the same question, like, hey, why are we refuting? So this is the personal opinion. It would be like if I would give you an opinion, and then you say, hey, and then the Gemara would continue and tell us the Mishnah that says otherwise. You would not be able to say, hey, how can the Mishnah say otherwise? Rabbi said different. No. Rabbi Bar Chana and Rav have the right to have differing opinions, and indeed, that is the case. We would say that Rabbi Bar Chana embraces the opinion of the Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, which is also the opinion of Shmuel. If you're confused, folks, please just delete the last 30 seconds of comments. The point that Rabbi Errol asked very, very, very wisely is somebody already takes a halachic position, but that does not preclude Rav, Shmuel, and Rav Asi all from having their own opinions. Our Gemara now wants to know where does Rav Asi take his opinion? Rav Asi, living in the era of the Talmudic analysis and discussion, cannot dispute, cannot go against a Mishnah. However, if there is another sage of the Mishnah that has a different opinion than the two above mentioned opinions, well then Rav Asi can certainly hang his hat on their opinion and he would not be in breach of Talmud protocol. Now bear with me a moment if our computer will load.
While you're looking, Dr. Hammer could tell us how many books are written on what is intent.
And then we'd invite a lawyer and they'd probably have a whole nother perspective on what intent is.
We have a whole masechet.
Absolutely. Well, by the way, a lot of Shabbos, as we're noticing, is concerned about intent. How valuable is subconscious, doctor?
But I also think that in terms of this discussion, it goes back to different, again, the creativity that people have in using things in different ways, and therefore they put it in a category that's not a problem for them to do it. They don't think of these things. They need a chair, and there's a side table there, so they take off the fruit basket that's on the side table, and they say, okay, you have a place to sit. And they don't question, are they building a new piece of furniture, calling it a chair? As I'm saying, and it's done automatically because their brain is wired to meet the need in a nice way and not even think that they might be committing an avera in doing so.
It's called justification.
Hold on, no. I love what the doctor just said. Let me see if I can translate it. What Dr. Hammer is saying is that according to Rav Asi, he assumes most people don't have functional fixedness, and therefore, as soon as a person displays by their actions that they strongly conceive these branches as sitting material, well, then that is sufficient to not be muksa, because the person is displaying to us how he perceives it.
Right. Got it.
Whereas maybe, according to Rav, according to the Tanakama, there's a lot more functional fixedness, and the average use of a palm branch is for fire, and therefore it's going to take an action to show that you really grasp, you really perceive this to be now a seating arrangement. And so once again, Shkoyach, doctor, and this is a very good paradigm to understand, or at least a way understand from a psychology standpoint. By the way, doctor, we should look into if we could arrange a accreditation for psychology continuing education. All right. So the Gemara again wants to understand Rav Asi, and I think the doctor made a very good case that he is weighing in on the default way, or how do we know if a person has broad creativity in their conception of what things are to be used for? And by sitting on it, he shows that he sees this as a sitting material. And so he's not necessarily saying this is absolutely not for fire, but he sees it clearly, equally, and instinctively as something to be used for sitting, and therefore it is not muktzah. And perhaps this gives us additional clarity on the other dove, other barrel, who asked about if you said, if I need it, I'll use it. Well, maybe according to Rav Asi, that might also be sufficient because he perceives it as something that's used for sitting. But let's see, the Gemara now is going to bring us a Mishnah or a Brisa that's going to support Rav Asi. And we're going to have to use our creativity to appreciate the Brisa and to see how it applies to Rav Asi. Who, Rav Asi, the Omar, who gave his opinion, which was sitting prior to Shabbos, indicates where his mind is at. Kihai Tana would be consistent with the Tana. The Mishnaic sage is quoted in a Brisa, the Tanya. What does it say? Yoitzin b'faroikinu v'tzifa. As we know, a person cannot carry items into the public domain. However, a person is allowed to wear clothing into the public domain, thank God, because otherwise we'd be in a lot of trouble. You're allowed to wear clothing. So the question is, what is the line between clothing and carrying? Now, most times we carry stuff in our hands, but it is conceivable that a person could carry something on their person in a different way, in a pocket.
People tie a key to the.
We're tying a key. Let's make a conscious effort to avoid discussing that topic now, because it's very practical and has important ramifications, and I don't want our theoretical conversation to be messing with that idea. But it is a good point to bring up. I just want to be very careful about not messing with halacha l'maisa as we wade through this discussion. So shkaya for bringing it up. But the key, okay. But so there's basically a fine line, or there's distinctions needed to be made between if what you're wearing is a garment, or if what you're doing is essentially carrying something, maybe not in a pocket, but you have it around your wrist or around your neck. And it's a broad discussion. There's a whole chapter in the Gemara that we're going to see soon enough about what is a person allowed to wear, what kind of jewelry or adornments are considered acceptable and whatnot. So we're going to have a field day talking about it. But for now, let's just see what is being quoted here, which is part of that discussion. A person is allowed to go out while wearing on their person combed flax or combed wool. When? You got to fill in the when. But first, let's see Rashi. Pakurin. So I think, I'm not sure if I read that correctly the first time, but pakorin. Pishton sorek shenoistam alamaka. Here we're describing combed flax that is put on a wound, akin to the way today we might use a Band-Aid. And I think if you have to choose between combed flax and a Band-Aid, or a bandage, I would say put on the bandage. But in those days, that's what they had. Sipa, semer, menupat, haniten alamaka. And sipa means combed wool, which was also occasionally placed on a wound. Why would you place fiber stuff on a wound? So Rashi here says, well, no, let's see. Bisman shetzav on, if they are dyed bishemen, or if they're dipped in oil, ukrachan b'meshicha, and they're tied on with twine, then it is not muktzah. Like tzalman b'shemen, if it wasn't dipped in oil, but like karcham b'meshicha, and it wasn't applied with this twine, and yotzim b'hem, you cannot carry them. What's the difference? So the difference is obvious. The reason why people would put a bandage on their clothing back then was not necessarily purely for it to heal, but also because if you had a wound, you don't want to stain your clothing. And so you'll put these fibers over your wound to absorb the blood and to avoid damaging your clothing. Gali date, by treating it with oil, which I imagine might respond. I asked you, why would you want to have these loose fibers getting into a wound? I suppose by coating it with this oil, it would probably become less prone to sticking on your wound, and it would help the garment heal, I suppose. Now you're going to ask, Rabbi, why weren't they worried about an oil stain? I hear you. I don't know, but I imagine it was created in a way that didn't stain, or maybe oil stains were just that was acceptable. And let's see. These actions indicate that he's using it to treat a wound, to place it on a. I might have to revise what I just said. So hold on. To place it on the wound on Shabbos. This is not intended to be a medical treatment, but rather to prevent the garments from interfering with his wound. The Havalei Malbush de Alma. And now that he's protecting, so I said it was about protecting the garments from his wound, which I guess would also be so, but it seems like also you don't want your garment messing with your healing wound. And so these treatments are more like a garment, or it's more part of the clothing arena than the healing arena. If it wasn't treated with oil, then then it's as if you're just carrying something. So again, we have a teaching about certain kinds of comb wool, comb flax, which one is allowed to wear on their person when it's treated in a way that indicates that it's part of the clothing style arena. If it's not treated, then you cannot wear them on Shabbos because it would be considered carrying. Here's the punchline. If he wore it out of the house in the public domain on Erev Shabbos, the sun has not yet set. Although it wasn't dyed or dipped and it wasn't bound, he is permitted to wear it out because his actions point to the fact that this should be acceptable. Let me read Rabbi Steinsaltz's commentary, and then we'll see if we can figure out how it applies to our Gemara. Apparently, there is a Tana who maintains that using an item before Shabbos enables one to use it on Shabbos as well. No additional steps are necessary. So let's recall. This material, to be used on Shabbos, would need to be treated with oil, dipped in oil, and bound in a specific way that was done. However, if he wears it on Erev Shabbos, the action of wearing it on Erev Shabbos makes it permissible. Now, you're probably bothered by this. If you're bothered by this, please feel free to speak up, because I'm having a specific problem, but I want to hear what you're thinking first. Anyone concerned by this analogy, the analogy of this Braita about wearing this piece of material to apply to our discussion of if the palm branch is muktzah or not, is it usable on Shabbos or not?
Well, it opens up the door to all kinds of interpretation.
What do you mean?
Just using it for a while permanently. Did he know what he was doing? Because, intention, I was just thinking, intention could work the other way also. Let's say you're allowed to wear clothes, no problem, on Shabbos, but then it gets cold. Can you put on a sweater thinking my wife might be cold, I'm going to take the sweater, wear it, and then give it to her?
Well, sweaters aren't muktzah, so that's a different matter. But I hear your question. You're asking, what does my kavanah do for you?
Yeah, it could work the other way. Could it limit what I do? Because all we're doing so far is trying to find a way to have more stuff usable. But it could work the other way maybe sometimes.
So I'll tell you what my problem is. I need to review Rashi again. So I don't want to. Okay, I see what we're saying. I told you that it was about carrying outside. That's true, but that's not the full extent of it. something that's for refuah, something that's for healing. I'm just upgrading or adding an additional line of explanation. Something that you're not allowed, unless a person is in danger, you're not allowed to do medical healing stuff on Shabbos. Again, pikuach nefesh, person that is in jeopardy, obviously we can do anything to save their life. So, or just about anything. But when it's not at all a danger, but it is considered a medical therapy, medical treatment, that is typically prohibited on Shabbos. So if this item is medical healing in nature, it's not only that it's considered a malbush, it's not only that it would be considered a garment, but it would be prohibited because it would be muksa. That's how I think we must understand this text. By saying you're allowed to wear it and carry it, it's not just about carrying in a public domain, which is what I initially explained to you, but it's also about muksa. And what we're saying is, if you wore it even for one moment prior to Shabbos, it's permissible now to carry. It is not muksa, just like Rav Asi's comment. Where I don't understand, again, this is where I have a problem, is I don't see the comparison. The palm branches have two potential uses, one permitted and one prohibited. And by sitting on it, he's showing that he wants to use it for a permissible function. Because the alternative would be to burn it for firewood. But here, this wool, couldn't you carry it in a weekday also? Couldn't you carry it in a weekday too? So the fact that you're wearing it one moment before Shabbos doesn't necessarily point to the fact that you want to have a permissible use. So I hear the analogy. The analogy is, if you wear something Erev Shabbos, if you use something before Shabbos, it's permitted to be used on Shabbos. However, I'm still having a problem with the exact analogy. But for the purpose of this Gemara, we have an analogy. Use prior to Shabbos makes it permitted to be used on Shabbos, and it indicates somehow that the use is a permissible use. Rabbi Steinsaltz cleverly, I think, you know, when you see something a certain way and you see it everywhere, but I think Rabbi Steinsaltz is delicately avoiding the intricacies of muksa, and by just saying very open-endedly like this. Apparently, there is a Tana who says that if you use an item before Shabbos, you can now use it on Shabbos. He doesn't get into the whole muksa and carry and use. So I still have a problem. The problem again is there's a difference between using something to indicate your intention and just using something because you're using it. But at this point, that's how the Gemara sees it.
You have a clue when he says apparently.
Right. So stand by. The Gemara is going to continue its analysis, but I don't even understand the happen. Okay. Amar Rav Ashi commented, Af ana nami tenena. Similarly, we have been taught regarding the laws of muksa designation prior to Shabbos and on Shabbos. Hakash, straw, shalgabe amita, that's on the bed. And this is gonna bring up topics that were asked when we were talking about our original discussion about muksa, about money on a bed. And could you use the? Okay. We were taught as follows: straw on a bed. Lo yinaneno biyadai, don't handle it with your hands. Avomenanoi begufoi, however, it can be moved with his body. You're allowed to sleep on it. Avo imhoya olav machal behema. If it either had animal feed or he placed bedding on it before Shabbos, menanoi biyadai, he is allowed to move it. It is entirely not muksa shmamina. What do we have? We have another Mishnah that shows that an action alone can indicate that the item is not muksa. It's intended for permissible use. So you have bedding, you have straw. Straw can be used to feed animals, and it can be used for your bedding. If it's used for animals, it is ostensibly muksa. If it's used for sleeping, it is not muksa. If you do something to indicate before Shabbos that you're going to use it in a permissible way, then it is not muksa. Let's read Rashi. Kash, straw. Stame latina koi. Oh, you see, Rashi takes it a step further. I said it's the default is for feeding animals. No. The default use of straw at the time of this text's composition was to build bricks or to fire up, to make fire. You're not allowed to build bricks, and you're not allowed to kindle a fire on Shabbos. I imagine I'm not saying something that you're not familiar with. The imhaya nasan alamita, but if the straw is on a bed, the loy lishkav alav, ubava Shabbos lishkav alav. It was on the bed, but he wasn't necessarily intending to sleep on it. But then Shabbos came and you need to sleep on it. Now it needs to be laid out in a sleeping way, because straw isn't always comfortable. It has to be spread out. So if he didn't intend prior to Shabbos to use the straw, and now he wants to use it, he shouldn't use his hands to make the bed comfortable, but he could use his body to distribute the straw. Again, this is Rashi's analysis on the beginning of the Mishnah. You shouldn't use your hands because it's muksa. But he could use his body. Anyone wondering if it's muksa, why do we distinguish between your hands and your body? If it's prohibited to handle, you shouldn't be allowed to handle it at all. I'm sure someone here is wondering that. So Rashi says this is considered kil'achar yad. This is in the atypical manner where with muksa, certain types of muksa, we give a leniency to handle it in an atypical manner.
It typically was like a shinoi type of thing.
Yes, a shinoi. A shinoi is a different way of doing it. And in Rashi's language and the Gemara's language, kil'achar yad, in a different and normal way. So let me just recap here, because I know there's a lot that's going on. We're talking about straw, which the default use of straw is muksa, asr, and prohibited. Muksa, machmas, asr. If you actively designate it for a permissible use, it is not muksa. So we have the straw. You see straw, halacha, at least this Mishnah, has a certain degree of functional fixedness. Halacha looks at straw and sees fire or bricks, asr. However, we have enough flexibility in our conception that if you did an action like put a pillow next to the straw, okay, obviously now with that extra clue, we conceive the straw as sleeping material. Or if you put in animal feed, now we are sufficiently flexible in our conception that we can imagine that this is going to now be used to feed animals. And although I initially said that feeding animals is problematic, and it is, if it's your own animals, you are allowed to and must provide for your animals on Shabbos. So this text tells us default assumption, muksa. If he did something to indicate that it is not muksa, it is not muksa. Rashi, sheshachav olav mimah. Oh, you see? Let's read Rashi together, because Rashi explains this different than I did. And it's necessary to see Rashi. What did I say? I said that if there's a pillow there, it's like you tied it. You did an action to indicate, it's like you put a sign that said this is used for sleeping. But that would be a problem. So Rashi understands it differently. Why is there a pillow there? It means that you slept on it already. So if you slept on it, although you didn't designate it, and maybe you didn't even have an active machshava to use it, still, this is a display of your functional flexibility. I know that's not the clinical word, but by sleeping on it, you've shown that you conceive this as sleeping material in addition to its primary use. You are not struggling with functional fixedness, and therefore we see that simply sleeping on it would be sufficient. Shma mina. And the Gemara says this is indeed indicates that Rav Asi has Mishnah precedent. But I've already shared with you my problem. My problem with this text is that if you wouldn't have Rashi here, I would have imagined that a pillow or a sheet is more akin to kosher, to tying it, than to just sleeping on it. So let me give you a recap of what the Gemara is saying, because I keep on telling you what I think, why I don't understand the Gemara, but I want you to understand what the Gemara is saying. So let's just do a fast recap. We have three opinions about palm branches, how to make it not muksa on Shabbos. One opinion says palm branches are muksa. The only way that will allow you to intend, the only way we'll allow it to not be muksa and to be permitted for sitting is if you tie them together, which is a clear indication that's how you intend to use it. That is the opinion of the Tanakh. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel and Shmuel say no. As long as prior to Shabbos you had a machshava, you thought to yourself, I am so glad there's palm branches here. We're going to use it for our guests tomorrow. You had that machshava, you designated them for a permitted use, it is not musa. Those are the two opinions. Action or just mental designation. Machshava kavana. Rav Asi introduced the third opinion, which is that if you ever used it right before Shabbos in a way that is permissible use on Shabbos, you have taken these branches and made them no longer musa. So by sitting on them, you declared with your actions that you conceive these as to be used for sitting or can be used for sitting, and it is not musa. Those are the three opinions. Our Gemara asks, is there a Mishnaic precedent for the opinion of Rav Asi, who lived in the Gemara era, in the Amora? He was an Amora, a teacher of the Gemara. And so our Gemara brought a brisa that had to do with Shabbos, putting certain stuff on a wound prior to Shabbos. It would be permissible to wear on Shabbos, even though had you not worn it prior to Shabbos, it would be prohibited on Shabbos. So what we see is that by using it once before Shabbos, it becomes permissible. That's what the Gemara says, and that's the proof the Gemara gives. And then the Gemara continues and says, we also have a Mishnah that says the same idea. And it was about straw, that if you slept on the straw before Shabbos, now you're, for the laws of Muksa, halacha imagines that this item is considered available for permissible use, for sleeping, and therefore it is not Muksa. Even though you didn't have you didn't have a conscious kavana, and even though you didn't have a conscious action, but your behavior indicates that you strongly conceive this as with a permissible use, and therefore it's not Muksa. And the Mishnah of the straw would be a good precedent for Rav Asi. That's what our Gemara said. Now, I had two problems, which I shared with you, which may have made this thing confusing. Problem one was, why is the instance of the twine identical to our Mishnah? I didn't see this not necessarily exclusively a discussion of Muksa, but also the two ways of using the twine are to indicate what it's being used for. If it's being used for garments, fashion considerations, or medical considerations, and I don't see, again, this is my problem. I don't understand how using it Erev Shabbos in an untreated way should make it now considered fashion and not medicine. I don't see that. So I'm obviously missing something. That was my issue number one. And then issue number two is the way I see the straw, it sounds more identical with, if you put a pillow or something next to it, why is that not akin to tying it and indicating the need of action? Why does Rashi and why does our Gemara understand this to be a simple act without kavana, which is yet a clue that it's permissible to use on Shabbos? Those are silly questions that I'm sure are easily answered, but because I expressed them, I just wanted to share them with you in their context so they won't confuse you from understanding the Gemara. And again, as always, the paradigm to understand the idea of functional fictionist truly does help us understand the halakhic, the discussion of how to understand and how to conceive and what halacha understands its primary use to be. Oh no, it's Tosfos. Hold on. Bear with me a moment. Okay, you want in the next moment, let's take a look at Tosfos. Tosfos totally changes the definition of these items. So it's fun if nothing else. We translated Pirukin of Tzipa as fibers that were used to be placed on a wound, right? That's what Rashi says. Tosfos has an entirely other idea of what these are used for, and it might force us to totally reimagine the Gemara. But let's take a look. What does Rabbeinu Chananel say Perukin B'tzipa is? A toupee. Kippah sheyeshba seyar. It's a kind of headgear that has fibers. And a person who is balding might wear it. And it appears like it is their hair. And now, again, I'm not going to translate the whole Gemara yet, but basically now the Gemara is not describing a wound thing, but it's describing how a person ought to treat their toupee so that it should have a most natural appearance. And it's not easy to have hair loss, and it's not easy to find to treat one's hair in a way that, it's certainly, a matter that could create some complexity. Lav dafka ein yotzim. So Tosfos acknowledges my problem. Tosfos is like therapy in this case. Tosfos says, Lav dafka ein yotzim. You have to read the Mishnah with a broader imagination. The Mishnah uses the word ein yotzim. You can't carry it on Shabbos. But as I pointed out to you, it would also be muksa. Afilu l'taltal asar. It would even be prohibited to handle indoors. Because it is not prepared to be used in a permissible way. The only reason why we use the phrase ein yotzim, which is not about muksa but carrying, is agav reisha. It's because the broader context of the Mishnah is talking about stuff that you can't carry in a public domain. And so by wearing the toupee, Erev Shabbos, according to Tosfos, this is an indication that you plan on wearing the toupee in such a manner. Whereas if you didn't wear it, then essentially it's a collection of fibers, and by wearing it now, it's muksa, and so therefore you're not allowed to wear it. Okay, and Tosfos here, it's too long to go into now, but Tosfos, I believe, is acknowledging my other problem here as well, which is what does wearing it do if it's still prohibited in use? So I don't want to read this Tosfos now. All right, I'm going to hold off on this Tosfos for now, but I believe Tosfos is acknowledging the question that I shared with you. We have 5 minutes left. Let us dip our toes into the next. No, I'm sorry. We have a final paragraph that we need to read of this Gemara. Man Tana de Poligale de Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Let's go back. We're talking about palm branches again. And we talked about how to make palm branches permissible to use on Shabbos. And the permitted use, we said, was for sitting. And we had a discussion, do you need to tie it or just have machshava? And Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says machshava is sufficient. And the first opinion says, no, you have to tie it. Who is the one that said you got to tie it? That's what our Gemara asks. Man, Tana, de Poligale, de Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Who says that machshava alone is insufficient and says that you need to do an action? You know who it is? Dr. Hammer, do you want to know who your opponent? Yes. Not opponent, but so the Gemara says Rabbi Chanina ben Akiva. Rabbi Chanina ben Akiva. Who is Rabbi Chanina ben Akiva? So here it says Akavia, and I read it Akiva. So let's just take a moment to see what Rabbi Steinsaltz is. The Sefaria. Like his father, we didn't say who his father is, but I'm assuming that the text that is coming from it brings him right after his father. Hanania ben Akavia, who lived in the time of Rav Meir, showed great independence in his teaching, and he lived in Tiberias where he was a rabbi. So based on the Sefaria bio, Akavia, there's a big difference if it's Akavia or Akiva. But anyways, for now we know it's Chanina ben Akiva, whoever that is. Let's do this. No. Anyway, okay. This is the opinion of Chanina ben Akiva. The jury is still out on his exact identity. What is the teaching of Rabbi Chanina? He also Rav Dimi, Amar Zeiri, Rav Chanina. Because when Rav Dimi came from Israel, he said that Zeiri said in the name of Rabbi Chanina, Pamachas, once upon a time. So we're going to close out today's session with a story. Hamachas holach Rabbi Chanina ben Akiva. L'makam echad. Once Rabbi Chanina, son of Akiva or Akavia, went somewhere. Umotza chariyoi shel dekel shegadrim l'shum eitzim, and he found a lot of palm branches that were cut for the purpose of fire, or eitzim, for wood. Amar lehem letalmidav, and he told his students, it's Erev Shabbos, and we're going to be here, and we're going to need chairs. Su'u v'chashvu kidei sheneshev aleim l'machar. Go out and have machshava, have intent to sit on them tomorrow. Rashi. V'lo yadana ibeis hamishta have, ibeis ha'aval have. In the story's record, we don't know if the chairs were needed for a Beis Hamishta because there was a after party or there was a party for a wedding or for a shiva, but either way, they needed these seats. So hold on, now let's think for a moment. We said that Rabbi Chanina ben Akiva argues with Rabbi Gamliel. What does Rabbi Gamliel say? Machshava. What does Rabbi Chanina ben Akiva say? It's a tayit. So how does this prove that we have the opinion of Rabbi Chanina? Here. When the story included the details that these chairs were necessary for either a wedding feast or a Beis Aval. Dafka Beis Aval, Beis HaMishta, the treaty.
Hello?
The only time that machshava would be sufficient is because we're talking about the mitzvah of an Avel or a Mishnah.
It's okay. It has to
Aval hacha kasher in like kasher lay. But alternatively, under regular circumstances, it wouldn't be allowed to just have machshava. You'd have to actually tie it. Rashi the treaty. Okay, this is a little bit of a challenging Gemara as well. It takes a little bit of a stretch. But again, we have a story of Rabbi Chanina ben Akiva, Kavya, who told them that machshava was sufficient. But from the fact of the story where he says machshava is sufficient, has attached to it a very, very specific scenario of a mitzvah, a Beis Avel, or a Beis Mishnah, the Gemara infers that under typical normal circumstances, Rabbi Chanina would not be satisfied with machshava alone. Typically, there would need to be an action as well. My dear friends, that concludes today's Gemara. Admittedly,
Rabbi,
yes.
one thing that I'm struggling with is, could we think of a situation where intention would cause you not to be able to use something on Shabbos that you would have been able to use? Does it work both ways?
You're asking, can we designate something out of its permissible use and cause it to be exclusively a prohibited use?
Make it mukta by intention?
So for example, can I take a spoon, which is very, very permissible, and designate it to do something that's prohibited? I don't believe so, but you know what? We're gonna have to add that to a list that has 376 items, and this will be 377 on that list. Good question. So again, it's the fast recap. We explored the possible ways that a palm branch would be permitted or prohibited to use on Shabbos, and that was a launching pad to explore other similar questions about similar items, and again to explore action, machshava, or is there an action that could point to your intention, your subconscious intention? Is that sufficient? That concludes today's Gemara. Admittedly, a little bit of a Gemara that demands some creativity. Doctor, you had a comment?
Yeah, the last issue is interesting. If it were for Beis Avel or Chasana, because they're associated with mitzvot, then it's okay. But why can't you expand that and say, here we have Shabbos, and we want to have Oneg Shabbos, so you could be basically makil on most issues. If it facilitates that, rather than coming up with another chumrah and not enjoying the Shabbos. I mean, I just see a connection there.
Right. So I hear your question, and I share it. What I suspect is going on over here is that there's little instinct, halachic instinct, or inclination to be lenient retroactively on Shabbos. So once Shabbos hits, the status is what the status is. The shaila that we have here, that you have, that I have, is there a sliding scale of ways to change designation? And apparently what the Gemara is saying is that in that regards, there is a little bit of flexibility. What's the flexibility? If you're involved in a mitzvah, well then even the more stringent viewpoints would permit machshava, but that more stringent opinion would only permit machshava under certain circumstances. So I guess what your question really is there is an ideal, but does the guy who says that you actually have to tie it, does he really agree, but he'd prefer a strong action? And so I think we need to do a little more research and continue digging to really get down to what the extent of his opinion is. Is it just ideally there should be an action? Or does he say there must always be an action unless a mitzvah, which is another factor which will give more weight to your machshava? Maybe that's what he's saying.
Places to sit for Achnosas Orchim, Shabbos.
Right. So that's the next question. Suppose the doctor wants to really understand what's going on over here. Why are we going to make your life more miserable in the absence of a mitzvah? But the other side of the coin, which is the other barrel's question, is okay, but suppose that for whatever reason a mitzvah does give extra weight. The mitzvah makes machshava more potent for whatever reason, and we need to understand why. But assuming a mitzvah does make machshava more potent, well, where does it stop? What kinds of mitzvahs work for this combo, and which kind of mitzvahs don't work for this combo, according to Rabbi Chanina ben Akiva. So, bli neder, I'll try to read up a little bit more on this, and maybe tomorrow before we go into the next Gemara, I hope that I'll be able to share a little more, because this is something that is thought provoking, and we do want to understand what exactly have we done to have to machshava over here, or we need to understand a little bit more of the halachic mechanics here. And so, my dear friends, that concludes today's Gemara. I want to thank you all for being here. And again, a prayer for the safety, well-being of all of the residents of Klal Yisrael, and the people of Israel, and the soldiers that are, I know a certain number of Chayalim are being called up now from reserves. So we daven for their protection, success, and only good news from Eretz Yisrael, for Klal Yisrael. And everyone is invited in a moment when we end this chat, this link, this group, to please rejoin and study Chumash with Rabbi Shalom Ber.
Amen.
Have a good day.
Go ahead.